Hello again, it's Tim, and I wanted to explain to you how my process works in terms of a specific project that I am working on. Uh, Many years ago, there was a game called Mazes and Minotaurs. It decided to take basically the old school rules, the core elements of D&D, and translate them into a Greek-inspired role-playing game, as if the original creators had not used basically Tolkien-esque style fantasy to create their game. They just used Greek mythology. It was well produced. It is a tight little game. It does what it does quite well. And I generally liked it. So I wanted to take something like that, but instead go, what if the predecessor for almost all RPGs uh, was used a science fiction setting as inspiration first and foremost. So I started working on some rules because I read a lot of sci-fi. And while I was working on the rules and I was researching particularly the kind of sci-fi I wanted to use, which is very 1940s, 1950s pulp, two-fisted sci-fi with, color-coded uniforms and atomic disintegrators and all that jazz, but through a slightly different lens. While I was working on that, I stumbled upon some better games that did something similar, although they were not doing that exact kind of sci-fi. I looked at their rules and realized the rules I was writing was never going to live up to those. And that's fine. I realized that I am not the perfect writer for everything, but I saw it and said, well, this does kind of what I want to do pretty well. And so I looked at the rules I had and said, you know what, I'm just not good at writing these old school rules. So I'm going to consider doing something else with this concept. And I had already commissioned cover art for it, and I got the cover art, and that doubled down for me because the art was just so fantastic that it inspired me to change the direction slightly with the rules I was writing. So I dug myself in. I started reading science fiction from the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, just books. I focused on that. I focused on short stories. I focused on the images of covers of various sci-fi magazines from those eras. Basically the bubble helmet and the skin-tight spacesuit style of sci-fi. And I realized that I wanted that feel, but I wanted a good set of rules to do it that focused on the various two-fisted pulp aspects and even science-forward concepts. But I wanted it to look like a 1950s-ish setting, but while using some true, actual hard science fiction. There are some elements that are, stretched to the breaking point from that. So I did this research, and I did this research, and I did this research, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I started writing a new set of rules. I then started playtesting it, and there were many times when I wasn't happy with what the rules were doing. I wasn't happy with the math of the way things were working. But I am one of those people who do not necessarily look at the math and say, okay, this is functional. I sit down at the table with people and play the game. I run it. I try to convince other people to run it so I can see from a player's point of view how it works. And I did that, and I went through several iterations of the rules, and I finally got a set of rules that I'm happy with, which I have now. It needs some work in adding just setting material and a few other things, but I am finally happy with the rule set I've got, with one exception. I'm not quite sure how I want equipment to impact the mechanics of the game. In some games, it's very important. In other games, it's not so important. They're more what you might call costuming for what the characters are going to do. They're just little visual props so that you know that, okay, they use this device, but it doesn't really change what they're doing because they could probably have solved the problem without the device. And I looked at the sci-fi and I read it and I realized that it leans more towards the prop, even though my instinct is to make the various technology a little more hard-coded. But in some ways, it's just not that important because it's more important that their ingenuity, it's more important that their bravery impact play than whether they have a sonic screwdriver on hand. I'm not actually using Doctor Who as the basis of this, but that's a good, iconic piece of equipment that I can name, and most people who are into sci-fi will get. So that is what I'm doing. I am still working on that. I'm trying to push forward. I need to do a few more playtests with the mechanics, both with mechanics for the gear and without the mechanics for the gear, so I can see how they function and whether it is more ideal one or the other. I'm leaning very heavily towards it just being a prop, because even if they didn't have it, they would still find a solution. Although sometimes the solution is technobabble, and I understand that. And there are also other iconic pieces of science fiction technology, like the lens from the Lensman, which is the inspiration for the superhero Green Lanterns, among other things. And so, I'm trying to decide if the character should have iconic gear, general gear that everybody uses, or, just costuming, as I said. It's pretty common. For example, in Star Trek, I don't ever remember, and he may have because I haven't watched it recently because I was doing research a while back. I don't know that Captain Kirk ever used a tricorder. I know he used the phaser. I know he used his fists, but I don't think he ever actually interacted with the tricorder. But both Spock and McCoy did. So that leads to it being a prop in my mind. It may not in yours. So if you have a different opinion on how equipment should be done in a sci-fi game that focuses on the two-fisted actiony elements of sci-fi, let me know. Share it with me. And in the meantime, keep writing if you're writing and you're following these that I'm doing. Keep watching. I will come and answer questions if you wish, and I'm always willing to talk gaming with someone. Until then, bless.